Okay, just go wait 30 seconds or so. Looks like we're going to have a small audience today, but not amazing. So Dave is having hassles with audio by the looks of that. Let's see. All right. All right, let's see. It's 5 past, I think. Yep. Okay, I'll start now. I'll just share my screen. And I'm open to suggestions here, by the way. At the moment, I put up the title Microeconomics. That could imply 35 consecutive lectures on blaming microeconomic theory, which, even I would start to gag at that point. So I'm not sure that I'll necessarily do it that way. And I'll take your own feedback. If you find I spend too much time on supply and you want to move on to something other than micro, when I finish this set of lectures, let me know. But I will go through at least the whole of the supply area here. So that's the first topic. And I'm going to talk today about the origins of supply and demand, because it's something which is so much the way economists think that, you think it's always been there. It wasn't supply and demand something that the Tyrannosaurus said to the Stegosaurus. But of course, it has a much more recent history than that. And I want to go through where it came from very briefly. And essentially, the beginning of this was in Marshall. And the more you look at neoclassical economics, the more you find that Marshall is their version of Aristotle. Everything has to go back to the great book, and you can't be inconsistent with the great book. You can embellish the ideas, but you can't contradict them. That pretty much describes neoclassical economics. So you had the idea of, obviously utility maximizing consumers who interact with profit maximizing producers through a market that achieves equilibrium between supply and demand. That pretty much, you'll get your undergraduate degree if you can recite that sentence without gagging. And there are many people who've contributed to it. I call these ones the fathers. So the whole idea that utility is what we try to maximize, and that capitalism is human society in general is a utility maximizing entity, comes out of not exclusively, but Jeremy Bentham systematized it. Any lawyers here or people have experience in jurisprudence? Okay. Bentham was the source of the idea that punishment should fit the crime. And he even sat down in an armchair, I'm not joking, and went through working out what punishments he thought would be sufficient to prevent a whole set of crimes, stealing a loaf of bread, sleeping under a bridge, etc., etc. And then, so literally armchair logic to work out what punishment would be, and with the sufficient punishment, you could prevent all crimes. I found that argument really convincing. But he was the one who argued that it's all about utility maximization. And he was actually, if you look at his research on the interest rate, he was actually against having controls on the rate of interest, whereas Adam Smith was in favor of them. So it gives you an idea to the extent to which he was the foundation of the libertarian attitude to what the market should be. And Jean-Baptiste Say, I think I've mentioned Say in previous talks of talking about his argument about capitalists not wishing to consume money nor conceal it, which are two ludicrous ideas. And that's the supply creates its own demand. I've linked to the Wikipedia explanation of each person, because if I don't want to go into depth, then Wikipedia is pretty okay. And they'll still call me an associate professor from Western Sydney University, but at least they got the fact that I was a professor right. And when I can, I'm linking to the book as well here. So this is sort of Jeremy Bentham's major work on morals and legislation. And this one is the Catechism of Political Economy and so on. So if you want to go through and explore those, you can do that from the links when I give the lectures to Jordan to post up later. Corno, who gave us oligopoly theory, and he was right back in the early 1800s again. So these are all very early authors. And then Jevons, Walras, and Menger, all in the 1870s. And they're the ones we associate with the marginalist revolution in economics. What I see as an anti-revolution. It took us backwards, but that was the last time there was a paradigm shift in economics from the classical school to the neoclassical in the 1870s. Now, even though all those characters are important in neoclassical economics, the one who gives you the archetypal template for the theory is Marshall in his Principles of Economics. He wrote it first in 1890. I think he wrote 9 editions. up to the last one in 1920. He always wanted to write another book and never got around to doing it, which is one reason I'm pleased that I have finally written something other than a third edition of Debunking Economics with the one I've written while I've been here in Budapest. So that gives me at least two major works that I have. And I'm pretty certain this is the first time we ever saw a supply and demand diagram in the wild. There may have been an earlier one, so I've described it as Marshall's first supply and demand diagram. But one thing that's quite strange about the way Marshall wrote was, normally when you write a footnote, you put some nuance or some diversion from the main argument in the footnote. So it's something you want to talk about, but you don't want to distract the reader from the main point. So the complicated stuff goes in the body, nuances which distract go in the footnotes. Marshall instead wrote the complicated stuff in the body and simplifications in the footnotes. So and a lot of people will say today that neoclassical economics is Marshall's footnotes, and that's not an inaccurate characterization. So here is the very first one on page 346 of the definitive edition. I'll let it roll down, have the read. So there's the first occurrence of it. You've got a downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply, quantity on the horizontal axis, price on the vertical. And that is the reverse of what mathematicians would have done, because price is supposed to be the independent variable and quantity the dependent variable. It should be the other way around. But the economics is stuck with this from Marshall right from the outset. And notice, as I shall go to this one so you can see where my mouse is here. A stable commodity that obeys the law of diminishing return. And that's the main thing I'm going to be going through in this course, that there is pretty much no such commodity. So there you had, that's where supply and demand, equilibrium, diminishing marginal productivity are all turning up as accepted concepts. But if you look back before the neoclassical school, the classical school argued that price was set by the objective cost of production and not by the subjective preferences of the consumer. This is Ricardo, and I love how emphatic this statement is. It is the cost of production which must ultimately regulate the price of commodities and not, as has often been said, the proportion between supply and demand. So that's categorically rejecting the neoclassical way of thinking. Now, they didn't ignore demand affecting price temporarily, because Ricardo precisely after that point went on with the following statement: proportion may indeed for a time affect the market value until it's supplied in greater or lesser abundance, but this will only be temporary. Diminish the cost of hats and the price will ultimately fall to their new natural price, although demand should be double, treble, or quadruple. Okay? So very different. They did admit market demand could move price up or down, but their fundamental point of reference was what they called the natural price. Now, Marshall and the neoclassicals changed us away from the natural price to the short-run market price, and this is Marshall laying out what he intends doing in this part of the book. The notion of equilibrium, studied more carefully in later chapters, some account of the controversy where the cost of production or utility governors values given in an appendix. We said, but I might as well say a word or two here, and this is about all the people who've ever read of Marshall. We might as reasonably dispute whether it is the upper or the lower underblade of a pair of scissors that cuts a piece of paper as to whether value is governed by utility or cost of production. So this is seeing the two factors being necessary to set the price, and this is why neoclassicals regard their thinking as more sophisticated than the classical school, because the classical school only had one. Okay? They said cost of production sets price. We're more sophisticated. We see two causal factors there. It's often a part of the arrogance of neoclassicals on this front. The natural price still remains in the neoclassical model. If you draw their average total cost curve, the minimum of that is the absolute cost of production. It's supposed that competitive markets are supposed to be driven to that point. At that point, the minimum of the cost of production is what determines the cost independent of the demand. But the emphasis is definitely de-emphasized, and the emphasis goes instead on short-run market price determined by instantaneous supply and demand, and that's where marginal cost comes in. So marginal utility diminishing gives you a falling demand curve. Marginal cost rising gives you a rising supply curve. And equilibrium is where the two intersect. And the key concept in both the analysis of the consumer and the analysis of the producer, and this is important because I think in many ways you can regard their model of production as just an anagram of their model of consumption. The model of consumption is moderately sensible. The model of production, as we'll see, and I think you already realised this, is completely wrong. Okay? So diminishing returns. The consumer gets diminishing but still positive utility from consuming an extra banana. Okay? And that's ultimately causes the downward sloping demand curve, and production creates diminishing but still positive returns, and that's the ultimate cause of the upward sloping supply curve. So one is a mirror image of the other, and Schaffer talks about this. I'll cover that in next week's lecture. And of course, a defining element of the neoclassical school is to start their analysis with the isolated individual. You can find Robinson Crusoe type comments in the classical school, but generally speaking, Ricardo, Smith, and Marx would talk about landlords, proprietors, capitalists, bankers, and so on. They talked at the level of social classes, not at the level of the isolated individual. And here's the classic from Marshall: the simplest case of balance or equilibrium between desire and effort. Okay? When a person satisfies one of his wants by his own direct work. So we have where the boy picks blackberries for his own eating. The action of picking is probably pleasurable when you start. And the pleasure of eating is more than worth the trouble of picking for some time. But after you've eaten quite a bit, your desire to eat more falls, while the task of picking causes weariness, and therefore equilibrium is reached when the eagerness to play, it's doing something else, that's leisure. Eagerness for leisure takes over from the disinclination for work, and therefore you stop at that point. Okay, and the satisfaction you can get from picking fruit is arrived at its maximum at that particular point. And then any further picking would take more away in pleasure than he gained. So you stop when the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. And that's with an isolated individual. And now we need to explain how this applies at the overall level of the market. And that's what neoclassicals attempted to do. So you have diminishing but still positive utility from consumption, diminishing but still positive returns from production. And the market then is the extrapolation of this process for a single individual. You have consumers who are subject to diminishing marginal utility, and wave your hands a lot and you get a demand curve. I'll talk about that in more detail when I go into the actual topic of demand. Firms subject to diminishing marginal productivity, wave your hands, you get the supply curve. That's what I want to focus on in this set of lectures. How logical is diminishing marginal productivity? Can you get a supply curve out of it, and so on and so forth? So the whole focus is on how cost and benefits, costs are minimized, benefits are maximized, subject to those costs. So again, cost-benefit analysis is central to the way that neoclassicals think. So that's the overall background. I've got the slide here because at some point, I think I might expand that first component into a lecture on its own and then have this as another lecture. So whenever I change a topic, I'm going to insert a slide like this from now on. So the supply curve. And the basic logic here, you have diminishing marginal productivity directly causes rising marginal cost. It's intriguing. I've dealt with thousands of students over my 30 years as an academic, and I think most of them don't get the point that the only basis of rising marginal cost is diminishing marginal productivity. Okay? They get other stuff in their way. Think about having to pay more for workers, overtime rates and stuff like that. They'll find any reason to give you an upward sloping supply curve. But the only reason, in theory, is diminishing marginal productivity. So the idea is you have fixed inputs, machinery, factories, et cetera, that you can't vary. And that's a reasonable thing to have as an abstraction. And then variable inputs, labor, raw materials, which you can vary. So you can put a small amount of variable factors or a large amount into the same amount of fixed factors. And there's an ideal ratio of variable inputs to fixed inputs. This is where I see a lot of analogies about food, how they think about food and consumption. But there's an ideal ratio. You'll start at below the ratio, And as you start below that ratio and get up to the stage where you have an ideal ratio, where you get the perfect proportion of variable inputs to fixed inputs, you'll get rising marginal productivity. So the production curve will curve upwards. Then you peak at that point, and from that point on, the production curve continues to rise, but at a diminishing rate. So you can have rising productivity, reach a maximum, and then falling, and that's how they come together. So just to illustrate that over here, if you have, this is the sort of thing you'll find in plenty of textbooks. You have quantity rising at a rising rate for a while, reaching a maximum rate of growth of quantity with respect to labor, and then tapering. And if you take the derivative of that, what you get is a curve that does this, okay? Rises for a while, reaches the peak, which is when the slope here is highest, and then falls down to zero when the slope there goes to being horizontal. So that's the basic logic. Now, I want to just go step by step through that because it's essential to understand that. Otherwise, you can't see why it's so critical to show diminishing marginal productivity doesn't actually apply. So you start off with this quantity curve, labor on the horizontal axis and quantity on the vertical. To get to the beginning of the cost curve, the first thing you do is you take the mirror image. You reflect that on the 45-degree line. Basically, you work out the inverse function. Now you've got quantity on the horizontal and labor on the vertical. So that's stage one. Then you multiply by the wage because according to the theory, you buy all the variable inputs at exactly the same price. Everything's supposed to be a price taker. So the firm hiring more workers doesn't change the wage rate. All the workers are the same quality, so there's no change in their capability for productivity. So if you multiply the wage by the amount of labor, you now get the total cost curve. Okay? That's your variable cost curve, pardon me. Then you add on fixed costs, which means you simply lift that curve up over here. So you've got a higher curve, and that's now total cost, which is the sum of fixed cost plus variable cost. And now you calculate the slope of the curve. So you then redraw the curve again, and then you whack a few tangents and see what happens. And the tangents get flatter for a while, and then they get steeper. And then you put those tangents on their own curve, and what you've got is, first of all, falling, and then rising marginal cost. Okay, that's the sequence. That's the way they get to it. Okay? And that becomes the supply curve. And that's the next trick. So you first of all assume perfect competition, and there's a major reason for that. Just quick, is anybody here aware of why you have to assume perfect competition to get the supply curve being the marginal cost curve? Okay, I'll cover that in a future lecture. I'm happy to cover it in discussion as well. And intriguingly, this problem that you need perfect competition to get that result was only worked out by Harrod in the 1930s. So a lot of this stuff, the problems came after the initial idea. So the idea is you have total revenue and total cost, which you'll draw on the vertical axis, and total revenue is a straight line. You either assume perfect competition or you just don't even know there is such a thing as marginal revenue, which came along later in the literature. So you just draw a straight line there. That's what you're going to get as you sell. You sell a higher number, you still get the same price, which is the slope of total revenue. And down here in marginal cost, that means you've got a constant price. So the price, and that's equal to marginal revenue, horizontal line. That's why in the current theory, they have to have perfect competition, because if you have a downward sloping price curve, you're going to have a steeper downward sloping marginal revenue curve. And there's absolutely no guarantee that you're going to get an upward sloping supply curve out of downward sloping marginal revenue, horizontal line there. Then you take fixed costs, and because they're constant in total terms, that means they must be a rectangular hyperbola in the bottom graph. And that becomes essential later on, by the way, because that constrains what you can draw in terms of average fixed cost versus variable cost to make it look at anything like what things look like in the textbook. So that's average fixed cost. Then you draw in total cost, and because that's the inverse function as before, it slopes, gets flatter, and it gets steep again. And this region here is where you're going to have revenue that exceeds your costs. So that's now average cost. I then divide this one by the quantity, and I'm going to get a downward sloping and then upward sloping, the classic U-shaped average cost curve. Marginal cost I've already worked out. That goes up through the bottom of average cost. And then you take, there's the point where marginal cost equals price, and that will be zero profits. Then you have the point where the gap between total revenue and total cost is the biggest. Marginal cost again equals price at that point. And what that's telling you is the slope of the slope of the average cost curve is the same as the slope of the total revenue curve. So marginal cost equals marginal revenue, maximum profit, and then a higher level again. If you go production past that point, you sacrifice profit. So an important point in the conventional theory is that people often say, what about firms that want to, sales maximize? And the very learned lecturer will say, well, somebody like John Hearn, for example, will say, oh, yes, well, you can sales maximize if you like, but that's going to sacrifice profit. Okay? So sales maximization comes at the expense of profit maximization in the conventional theory. Now, and I'm put question marks wherever there's something that is taken for granted by the mainstream and wrong. Okay. So if you have a market price that doesn't change with respect to the firm's output, then the point where price equals marginal cost, which is down here, identifies where the slope of total revenue equals the slope of total cost up here. And if you have rising marginal cost, that's where you maximize profits. Okay. And if you have an homogeneous product and a competitive industry, so you can say total revenue is market price times quantity, then you can now do the mathematics of this. So you have total cost is fixed cost F plus variable cost VC, and they're a function of quantity. And profit is pi is the gap between the two. So you start from saying profit is a function of quantity, is total revenue minus total cost, which is price times quantity, minus fixed cost plus the variable costs, which are a function of quantity. And then you take the differential. I'm doing it very slowly here, just so it's all logical. So you differentiate P times Q. That gives you a product rule. You have to break into two components. One of them is zero. And the other thing, you got the differential of fixed cost, which is also zero. Differential of variable cost is marginal cost. Price minus marginal cost is the differential of total profit. And then to get a maximum, you set that equal to zero. And that means price minus marginal cost equals zero. So price equals marginal cost maximizes profits. And that's a magic point in the first year education of a victim of neoclassical economics. So that's giving you the backstory. In effect, Marshall simply drew this curve initially and then had sort of hand-waving logic behind why it would have the shapes it has. Not really having worked it out in detail, certainly not doing the mathematics involved in it. So what then happened was that people afterwards said, well, how do we get this curve? And the first stage was proving that diminishing marginal productivity gives you rising marginal cost. But of course, it required some assumptions. So a homogeneous product. So what's a car for sell for these days? Anybody know? The price for the single firm doesn't change as its output changes. Now, the reason they give is there's actually a good reason for that, but not the one that they give. And later on, Harrod is the one who worked out the idea of what he called the increment of aggregate demand curve. This is in the 1930s, I think. And he was looking at a range of different situations, rising costs, falling costs, and so on. And in the middle of this article, he said that there would be, he's got a demand curve here, DD dash, which you can see, hang on, I'll go over here. DD dash, that's the demand curve. And then he worked out this other idea that as your price fell, your sales revenue would be affecting the falling price as well as the increase in quantity. So rather than the standard situation where there was no fall in price, you get less revenue. So he called this one the increment of aggregate demand curve, and that became marginal revenue. Now, that really upset the apple cart, okay? They didn't want to know about this. That's why after this point, neoclassical became so wedded to the idea of perfect competition, because they knew if they had anything other than perfect competition that they defined it, they couldn't have price equal to marginal cost. And that upsets the whole idea of utility maximizing behavior. Well, I'll discuss that later, a bit more detail later. So you now have diminishing marginal returns, and Schraffer, and that's what the next lecture is on, is showing how Schraffer challenged that on logical grounds in, just checking my time here, in 1926. And that's I'm going into that in quite a bit of detail in the next lecture. And also I start introducing the beginnings of empirical attempts to check this theory out, and probably the first major paper in the series of papers by empirical researchers into how firms actually set price is this one by Hall and Hitch. There's a couple of other ones that are slightly precede that, but I'll cover those next week. So that's my short opening. Let's have a chat. Hang on, so Dave here. I got to go to the work meeting. Okay, that's all right. Okay, yeah. So I feel like I've stopped too early when I stop at this point, but I know it suits the short lectures, and that's about a half hour. So, any comments?
Yeah, as an engineer, it always surprised me how the axes were embarrassed. So when I took micro, after all the engineering classes, I was like, I had to reframe every time I sat to read economics.
It's weird. I mean, I just taught that way right from the outset. Like, my first exposure to this was in year 11 of high school, and I'd done plenty of mathematics at the time, but I didn't even really think. If I've done engineering, I would have realized independent variable on the horizontal axis dependent on the vertical. Okay, it'd be intriguing to see. Maybe you should have a crack at that, mate. If you wouldn't mind having a bit of a play before next week, see what an engineer would do. Take the whole theory seriously, and then see how you'd plot it with the price on the horizontal axis. Oliver.
So you said that Marshall drew the supply and demand curve diagram in his book. What was it, 1890?
1890, yeah.
And without actually working out mathematics behind it. But where did he get that from? Where did that come from, and why did he draw it like that?
Oh, if you look back, you can find the same sort of ideas in Jevons, in particular. So Jevons, in many ways, is the predecessor to Marshall.
Right.
Marshall brings the whole lot together. That's why I call him the mother of this rather than one of the fathers. But yeah, the idea that there would be rising supply cost was accepted by all theorists. And there's, in empirical sense, there are reasons to expect that, because if we've all been to a vegetable market, and the prices will vary depending upon how many. Well, there'll be a set price, frankly, in most vegetable markets we see these days. But fish auctions and things like that, people were used to prices being bid up and bid down, and they think, oh, you want a higher price, you've got to pay more for it, and that sort of makes sense to people. Not that you pay a higher, if you want more, you buy it at the same price. That seems illogical to a lot of people. In fact, it tends to be what applies in most markets. And also, our thinking of markets evolved out of agricultural products initially, more so than manufactured. Even back in the 1770s, the majority. I don't know how much people would have spent on food versus manufactured goods. Probably more than 50% on food, at a guess. But you therefore have those sorts of prices, and in mainstream neoclassical theory and post-Keynesian both accept those prices change, and there is some explanation for a rising price for a larger volume. But yeah, that was basically the sort of background thinking that would happen, and then Marshall put it together in that diagram pretty much for the first time.
Right, thanks.
Okay, Ignacio.
Hi, Steve. So I wanted to know if we can dig a little deeper on that part of perfect competition, because I do remember that in those basic micro classes, you also see monopoly models where the marginal revenue does vary with the quantity of production. So I don't know if I understood your point on that part of perfect competition.
Okay, I'll cover it in more detail. I mean, I'm going to demolish it before I cover it, which is a bit. I know I want to get some feedback from you people on how well this all works, because I'd normally go through a whole set of lectures laying out the neoclassical theory, and then I'd demolish it at that point. But what I'm more inclined to do in this course is to put out what they believe, show why it's wrong, and then go on to the next point. But if you draw a horizontal line for price facing an individual firm, then that's price is equal to marginal revenue. Your profit maximization point is where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. that occurs where the price goes horizontally. So there's no need to draw a line up from marginal revenue to price because you're already on marginal revenue. If you have a monopoly, then the idea is the monopoly's got a downward sloping demand curve and an even more steeply downward sloping marginal revenue curve. The monopoly maximizes profit by choosing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and then goes up to the price curve to work out what price to charge at. Now, if you then imagine a different demand curve, say a flatter demand curve, then you get a different marginal revenue curve. And you might well find that if you do points between, moving one demand curve and moving the other, your supply curve will slope down, not up. So the only way to guarantee get an upward sloping supply curve is to assume price equals marginal revenue. That's why it's so essential.
And is there like a formal place where I can check that? So like more mathematical to see that?
I can actually, like, what I might do with this, because I've got a whole set of lectures I've written on these topics, as you can imagine, over time. I'll post those as well on school. But if you look at that, I go through, like in debunking economics. Have you got a copy of debunking economics?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have the figures? Because they were they were
I
marketed.
think I do. Yeah.
Okay. Check and see one of the diagrams there. I explain it, and I show you have like two different demand curves, two different marginal revenue curves, and when you do the work up from the point of intersection for each of the marginal revenue curves, and then join those 2 points together, you get a downward sloping supply curve. So to get away from that hassle, you have to assume, price equals marginal cost. You're back, Dave.
I'll check it.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. Okay. But I'll also remind me. I'll just give myself a reminder. Hang on a second, otherwise I'll forget. Okay, so I'll do that later. Has anybody read? Oh, yes, I can ask Carlos. Yeah.
Hi, Steve. I just wanted to ask you, what is the argument that neoclassical economists use when they tell you that for a firm to maximize profit, you have to equal marginal revenue to marginal cost. But in real life, you see firms all the time trying to maximize sales and maximize market share. So how do you reconcile those two things in real life when
It's simple. Simple. You ignore real life. That's what they do. Okay. And they'll say, well, they think they're maximizing sale, but they're actually maximizing profits. Or they'll say, well, they might be doing that, but they're silly because they'd make more profit if they sold less, et cetera, et cetera. So you get, I mean, the capacity to ignore reality when it doesn't fit the theory, I've ceased being amazed by it. I'm frustrated by it because that's why they're stuck in this, pre-Galilean way of thinking about the economy. But like I'll give you an example. I think I've mentioned a couple of times. I was asked by the Secretary of the Treasury in New Zealand to build a Minsky model of the New Zealand economy, and I was shafted by the Treasury economist who didn't want to touch it with a barge pole. I remember being one of them said, look, when I look out the window, I see supply equals demand. And I said, so you see walk past empty car yards every day, do you? He went, what? I said, well, if the supply equals demand, there'd be no stocks. How come there's leftover stocks? Why do you see clothes in the windows each night? Not just clothes on the display, you see rows and rows and rows of clothes inside the shop. Does that mean supply equals demand, or is demand less than supply? They just do not want to. They've got a conceptual framework which distorts how they see reality. And I always think about those. I've never used them. I'd love to give them a try. For those Gestalt glasses, okay, wear a set of glasses which are a prism, and they invert the world, and everything's upside down, and then suddenly your brain goes, whoa, and bang, you're looking, and you suddenly see, if they take it away, then the world looks upside down to you. But our brain behaves that way, and I think a large part of it is this Gestalt. They've got supply and demand in their eyes. That's what they see, no matter what they're looking at. Mario.
I was actually taking part in a lecture this semester, internet economics, and I thought when it comes to selling software, you know, there's no way you can apply this kind of marginal cost
Yeah.
thing to production and copying of software, but they do. They actually
They do.
Yeah, it's
You're
amazing.
kidding. I
Yes.
thought they do. I think they should ignore it and say that's a minor issue, but they actually
I
they
was
oh
I was
Jesus.
amazed. So that was, I mean, I can't even explain to you how they do it, because after a few minutes my brain just shut down
Yeah.
because of the loops they are doing to explain this. But it is amazing how far they go. So
It
and
is. Yeah.
again, there is no feeling of that is actually Cahel's argument that after 2007-9, you have sort of a revolution and rethinking economics comes in with the core textbook, and it changes a little bit and it's less drastic and less extreme. But at least at my university, they are teaching just the same stuff.
They will.
No
They'll never
change at all.
change. They'll never change.
Yeah.
I've given up on that. And like, you know, I must admit, when I went to Vicky Chick's, not her funeral, but a sort of wake for her after her death, I realized I'd been to Jeff Harcourt's and Peter Groenewegen, the two leading Australian economists, and now Vicky's, and Basil Moore died. And I thought, I'm going to die and this shit is still going to be taught at universities. You know, you just can't get rid of it. So the only way is to get rid of it is to get rid of them, frankly. Alwyn.
Hi, Steve. I really like what you just said about shops not running out of stock every evening before they close their doors. I think that would go really well in your 3A in the first half of your lecture. Indeed, I found that 3A very valuable and a great split between 3B, because it's, you know, it's separate kind of topics. But it seems to show that they go wrong even before the maths comes in, even before the stuff in 3B.
Yeah.
You were showing that they'd gone wrong anyway.
The only conceptual foundation for their thinking is a fish market.
Yeah.
Because of a fish market, if you don't sell them all on day one, it stinks and you've got to throw it in the ocean. Not all fish, but you know, you can freeze it these days. But if we go back to when they were doing it before refrigeration, then yes, you had to sell it. And as day went on and you didn't have buyers, then you dropped the price because it was better to sell than dump, you know. So the idea of a flexible price in a market where the stuff is disposed of if it's not sold, that makes sense. But you know, we live in a world now, not for much longer, in my unfortunate opinion, but a world in which if you don't sell something, it's there for purchase the next day. And therefore there's unsold stocks, and a huge issue in doing economics properly is actually to take stocks into account without having stock dynamics dominate everything you do in terms of your pricing theory. That's something I'm conscious of from my own work and trying to extend my Minsky model. But yeah, they just ignore all that, and they don't even know in that sense what stocks are, in a sense of including that in how they think about the real world.
And I think you've just come up with another addition to your 3A, because the idea of the fish market is great. It fits in with the shops not running out of stock. Those things should go into 3A and bulk out 3A. I think it's worth it. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Alwyn. I was actually taking note of that too. Okay. I'm going to call you Alfonso. What's going on here?
Poncho is a nickname for Alfonso. So I was using the account at work. I just want to confirm what we went over. So the graph slopes upward because of increasing marginal costs, supposedly, right?
Yeah.
One more produced will cost you more than the previous one. But I guess the way what I visualized it when I took the micro class was, and this is how they explain it online, is that the more that producers stand to gain from each unit, the more the economy will muster more supply.
Yeah, that's sort of a logically false, but sort of appealing argument that if you want to get more of something, you've got to pay more for it, and they will, you know, they will, and that's that is actually implies like a higher margin in that sense for the sellers. But in fact, in the actual theory, there's no higher margin. You've got an equilibrium profit rate coming out of it, and it's all driven by higher costs, not by a higher markup. But in the real world, I mean, we do see things like there's a lot of demand for something. We've seen this just recently with what was called greedflation by Isabella Weber and so on. If there's a large amount of demand in the economy, then firms will feel they can put their markups up and get a higher margin. So there's real world reasons why things like this do happen, but they will grab hold of it because that's partly why their ideas get into people's minds in the first place. When you look at the pure idea, that plays no role at all. So,
right. So
they will mix the two together.
So the second explanation is more or less everybody trying to make real world sense of the flawed supply curve, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, the whole, I mean, supply and demand again is timeless. You know, that's a point in time, and you're going to supply curve and a demand curve. Everything is through time. So the whole framing is just the wrong way to think about a capitalist economy producing over time. But that's the framing they're stuck with by their paradigm. And if they change it to anything involving time or involving markups and so on, the whole paradigm unravels. And that's why they are so rigid and sticking to their ideas despite empirical contradiction, despite not seeing things like the financial crisis coming and so on. They just reject elements of the real world where the real world contradicts with their theory. That's why I think the Galilean explanation is still the best. They don't want to look down that telescope.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. Any more? Yeah, cognitive dissonance is a huge part of it too. Very, very much agree with that in the chat. Carlos.
Yeah, Steve, if I may, I would like to ask you a question that it's not related to the presentation you just gave. I remember that you went to give a presentation on climate change last week.
Yeah.
And well, there are two things that got me worried this week. Last Monday, a newspaper, or it's a publication called the Epoch Times, published. Did you read that?
I used to write for them. God knows why they hired me, but I wrote for them for a while. I didn't mind the money, so I did it for a while. Yeah.
Well, they're saying that the NOAA's temperature monitoring stations are placed on faulty places. Therefore, the temperatures readings are wrong and climate change is a hoax. The thing is that a lot of people are falling for this crap.
I know.
And at the same time, I was reading today that a man was sentenced to 5 years in prison in the United States for leaking the tax returns of, I think, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos that show that these people pay no income tax. So I just wanted to ask you, do you still see hope for us being saved from a climate catastrophe?
No. Sorry to be blunt, but I don't. I think one is absolutely coming, and it could even be this year. I mean, that's one of the scary things. If you, I mean, the whole idea that scientists have been sloppy about putting their bloody measurement, they spend they're anal. Scientists spending the whole time trying to refine stuff like this and compensate for past errors and so on. So the whole idea that they've been sloppy, I mean, to me, I despair about education these days. I often think that it's what we get is like the kids at the back of the row who aren't paying attention and now standing at the front telling us how the world works. And, you know, caliber of educational learning has gone down the tube in the meantime. So, yeah, but yeah, I really am highly pessimistic. And when you look at the latest figures on the temperature anomaly, we hit half a degree above the previous year previous record. And the new temperature anomaly is coming through, and it's above last year's temperature anomaly. So it looks quite possible we could see 2 degrees this year. And the extra amount of energy in the atmosphere, I think is going to cause some exciting weather events this year. Where we saw enough last year, they could get weirder still this year. I just noticed that there was a cyclone went through northern Scotland yesterday with the winds of 116 miles an hour. Scotland, it is windy in the highlands, but your kilt doesn't take off like that. So there's, scary stuff coming our way. My last 2 plane journeys have been more exciting than I would like. And this seems to be coming at lots of airports, that the winds are so sudden and so shifty and so powerful that, I wonder whether we're going to see plane flights being banned or being drastically reduced as the year goes on as well. So, yeah, and that's just, highly pessimistic. And when we start seeing the scale of the effects, it'll be undermining our capacity to do anything about climate change at the same time, which is what really scares me. I've just given myself a note. I'll post the Jeffrey lecture straight after I finish doing a talk before I go home. I'll put that up on school. And there's I hope, tell me what you think. Watch it in slideshow mode, as you know. There's one of the slides, I think it's slide 5. I do an animated history of the Earth's temperature for the last 65 million years. And the point
How do you do that on Microsoft PowerPoint? I was just wondering. That was pretty cool.
Takes a lot of time using wipe effects and bounce effects and stuff like that to do it. It takes ages. That's why it takes long to get a lecture together. Like the one I just gave, where I had the supply curve and moving around and all that sort of jazz. But it's worth the effort. I find I quite like PowerPoint as a production tool. So yeah, but what I do is I'm also using Ravel in this presentation. So I've got the Ravel data, and I can easily take a segment out and then put that on the screen and have different graphs and move them past each other.
Okay. Thanks, Steve.
Okay, Dave.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. So I'm sorry I missed the lecture part. I got called into a meeting for the first half hour. So similar to the previous question, I have a kind of out of left field question. I was listening to a Chinese venture capitalist talking about, how China is different, the Western, and he mentioned how it used to be called political economy, but then it became just economy or economics. And I was curious to ask you in the group here, do you know when that changed and why?
It pretty much happened in the 1870s, and it was because Marx made political economy too political for the likings of capitalists. Yeah. So if you like the title of Ricardo's principles, I think was 1817. That was called Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. So it was quite respectable, political economy at that stage. And if you look back and see, like Petty, who wrote one of the very first forms of treatises in economics, he called it political arithmetic. Okay? So the idea that it was politics and economics were intertwined was an essential part of the classical school and so on. But Marx then used it as an argument for revolution. There were plenty of what they call Ricardian socialists who did the same thing. So the idea that economics is political, oh no, can't have that. So politics got a sponge, and it's just economics.
I see. Yeah, the Chinese guy said, that he kind of quipped that, the West had done its politics and didn't want anyone else doing their own.
Well, the Chinese have done the politics a damn sight better than the West has done. So they'd never admit that, but they have.
I'll post a video on the.
That'd be good. Yeah, put it up. That'd be good. Thank you, Oliver.
Yeah. So, first question is, Steve, how come you were writing climate skeptic articles for that magazine?
Sorry, pardon me.
How much money did they pay you to write?
It wasn't a lot. It was about $500 an article.
Oh, okay.
And I thought, I'm happy to do one a week, and sort of it kept a few. And then ultimately they simply stopped replying to my emails. So I was too left wing for them, obviously. And people, the one thing that really pisses me off. Really, I really get pissed off by left wingers saying, "Why are you writing for that right wing rag?" I said, "Because it's a right wing rag."
Yeah.
I mean, you want me to preach to the choir? I'll turn my ass on the world we want to convert and just preach to the choir if you like. But if I mean, I must admit, one of my big regrets recently, I got asked to write a promotional thing about cryptocurrency. What? And so they asked me for it and said, how much? I said, well, I would accept less than 1,000. Done. As soon as I said $1,000, bang, it was. He basically, I'm sure a budget of 10,000.
I saw it.
I should have said video. I should have said 10,000 and bargained me down. I was too bloody me generous and said 1,000. So I had one and only one the video on cryptocurrencies, and I trashed them while supposedly promoting this new cryptocurrency launch. So I also worked for Murdoch. Should mention that. I spent about 1.5 years working for Murdoch. The reason being that I used to write for a magazine I used to write my blog posts, and an Australian magazine called Business Spectator would lift them for free. And I was happy to get my ideas up before the financial crisis, so I didn't complain. But I finally saw the editor and said, look, Alan, I'd like you to pay me for these. He said, I would like to, Steve. We don't really make money out of Business Spectator. We make money out of a stock picking thing called the Eureka Report. So we can't really afford to do it. I said, all right, okay, keep on doing it. And then about 4 months later, they were bought by Murdoch for $45 million. And I said, right, Rupert does not get my stuff for free. And they then came to see me saying, look, you're the best Reds commentator on the site. What would we have to pay you to get you to write for us again? And then I said, well, I wouldn't do it for less than $1,000 a week. And then I banked that for about 1 year. And then I got shafted by Western Sydney. So if I hadn't put the money aside from Rupert, I would have had a very hard time, and I got made redundant by University of Western Sydney. So I've worked for Epoch Times and Rupert Murdoch.
Good. So my more sort of serious comment is about the temperature rise in 2023, right? So I saw an article in the Financial Times earlier this month, actually, and it was really good. I've been trying to find it actually to post it, but they had a really nice chart which says it's an interactive, you can draw your own line for 2023. Have a go at what you think the temperature was, and of course it's just way out of line from any previous year in a way that the scientists weren't expecting. And the scientists don't actually know why it's happened. So there's a few competing explanations, but they don't know whether this is a permanent change in the trend or it's a temporary thing that's going to go back down again. And I just think it's really interesting that after like 30 years of IPCC reports, we're effectively still flying blind. And then you have to look at what is going on with the IPCC. And also a few days ago, I saw something where it said the government's had a meeting where they had to decide whether IPCC was going to carry on with the same 5 to 7 year cycle or switch to doing something else. So if you would expect maybe you want to, report annually, for example, but no, they decided stick with the same schedule. Next major reports in 2028, right? And then, so if I was a scientist in the IPCC, I'd just walk away and say I'm not doing it anymore, right? Because there's no point. So I think, I think that the sort of link to economics maybe it's about ideology. So the climate change is very inconvenient for capitalism and for free market ideology. So if you can do something that sort of appears that you're actually addressing it but isn't, I think that's what's going on. And neoclassical economics, it seems to me, it is almost purely ideological, right? Because there's no thank you.
So I was listening to you and trying to find the shot at the same time.
Yeah. That's it.
That's terrifying. I mean, I saw where did I see it? Some things I was thinking the IPCC report is to be conservative. Okay? Now, it's not being conservative, it's being radical, because it's saying this is the most conservative estimate of what we could face as a problem. A bit like saying, oh, there's an iceberg straight ahead. The most conservative thing that could happen is we could hit the bottom and go over the top and come down the other side, nice little slide. So we're going to report that. Now we're going to fucking sink. That's the most drastic. The conservative is the most dangerous. That's what you should do. Your conservative estimation should be, what's the worst that could happen? We have to fucking avoid that.
That's the risk management view, yeah.
What's exactly? So this is just stunning. This is North Atlantic, so it's it's 0 to 60 degrees north, so it's not including the polar region. But you get up here, the gap here, that is 0.7 roughly to 1.5 and a bit, so half a degree above the previous record. It's just the North Atlantic, it's not the whole globe, but this is still down pretty close. You come over here, and 2024 is about 2.2 of a degree above what 2023 was. So it's scary as shit as to the sheer scale. As you say, people have got all sorts of competing theories. So the most worrying I've seen, you would have seen as well, as the ending of sulfur dioxide pollution by ships. And ships you may have heard on the podcast that Phil Dobbie found an article claiming that the world's 19 biggest container vessels put out more pollution than the world's cars. He's not sure that that's correct. He found the source where he found that comment, but it still shows the extent to which the maritime transport is a huge contributor to both carbon dioxide, but also other pollutants. Well, if you take sulfur dioxide out of the petrol, let's have sulfur out of it so you don't get sulfur dioxide as a byproduct, that's potentially a huge removal of what was masking a previous temperature increase. So if that's true, if we've taken out the sulfur dioxide generated by burning the fuel, that has stopped the reflection that those particles used to do. That could have given us a jump of half a degree in temperature, and that's the scariest one. The only positive one that concerns them, which is transient, that I've seen out of this, is the argument that the Tonga volcano, which exploded last year, anybody see that? There was a satellite happened to be passing overhead as the explosion occurred, and you saw this little pimple and boom, like a huge region of the planet where this gigantic explosion cloud was coming up from the volcano. Well, that happened to have a large amount of moisture in it. And to give you an idea of how dry the stratosphere is, the increase in moisture caused by that one explosion increased the water, the H2O content of the stratosphere by 15%. Now, that can also have apparently effective increasing temperatures. So if that's true, then that will fall as the moisture vapor passes out of the stratosphere. But where there's two, it's still made like a spike and then back down again. Whatever way, we're getting a spike this year, and it could be up to 2 degrees above pre-industrial. And then even if it's transient, that is going to cause dramatic increases in climate volatility. And we should see some fairly, deadly impacts upon our productive systems this year.
Just maybe just to finish off on the point about ideology, though. I mean, I've concluded that we are going to need some kind of solar radiation management, right? It's unavoidable. But you've got a problem actually with the environmental movement, because the ideology of environmentalists is very anti it. But so there's not enough discussion. I mean, we should be debating this. We should be having a full, talking about all the options, talking about risk management, and talking about the balance of risks, and then getting ready for this. But we're not talking about it enough because, part of, if some things are seen to be beyond the pale by some people.
Yeah.
So you've got, on the one hand, you've got a lot of people who don't want to look at the downside, want to avoid thinking about it, and on the other hand, you've got the people who don't want to talk about some of the solutions that I think may be necessary. So there's just all across the board, people are not talking about this enough.
I'm actually, like, some of the thoughts I have in my head about what we need to do, you don't want to know. And we're going to. I mean, imagine, like, one of the main concerns I've got is I don't want to die unpleasantly. Okay? So what's a pleasant way to die? Okay. Starvation is not one of them. And I think, well, we need to reduce our pressure on this planet in every way possible, as fast as possible. And that doesn't mean keeping everybody alive. So, and then also geoengineering, we've got to fucking do it. We've been doing it for the last quarter millennium.
Well, yeah, we've been doing it for
Okay.
as long as humans
Ridiculous. So
Yeah.
we can't, we've got to discuss it. And
Yeah.
okay, the question is not, will it have adverse effects? The question is, how do one's adverse effects compare to the other adverse effects? Which one's likely to work most rapidly? Those are and when there's nobody, and that's why, like, I tried to scare the pants off the Jefferies people last week. I think I succeeded. And the whole idea is get people to wake the fuck up, because this is really about whether not only do we have a civilization, and I think that's odds of that surviving 20 years are pretty close to zero, it's whether we have a species. And people know there's only a handful of people who are talking that way, and I've avoided saying that in public, but we're being castigated by others, like Leon. No, I can't think of his last name, but Leon, who was involved in the paper with Jim Hansen, he's getting attacked by man for making those comments, because it's all about we can do it, we can make it, we can hang on to our lifestyle. All this sort of stuff is what dominates the dialogue, rather than the fear of, holy fuck, if we don't do something really serious, we're all going to get wiped out, and we'll have an extinction event that takes us and 95% of the life on the planet with us. Tony.
To carry on the discussion somewhat, there is a huge anti-nuclear propaganda from Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth. Friends of the Earth was founded to be an anti-nuclear.
Yeah.
But you've already shown that civilization requires energy.
Yeah, fundamentally,
James Hansen has shown that at 2 degrees global warming, you have wind speeds in excess of 200 miles per hour and storms that will pick up cars and dump them 10 miles away. If you think wind, solar, and any sort of so-called renewable energy production is going to survive any of that, you're living in absolute cloud cuckoo land. And to survive any sort of anything, we need energy, and we should be building 1,000 nuclear power stations a month, never mind a year or 10 years or whatever.
Yeah.
And the regulation and the safety requirements of it need to be totally revamped so that the regulators aren't anti-nuclear, which is the situation we're in at the moment. And I could go for hours if you wanted me to, but I'll stop there.
Like Copenhagen, if we've gotten the firm in Copenhagen is trying to build small modular nuclear reactors the size of a shipping container with 40 megawatts of power to them. And they intend turning them out on a factory basis. And if we did that, we would have power to be, less destroyable than a car. I've been actually looking at a solar system which involves it looks like a sunflower. And the thing is, so the sails go out in a sunflower shape, and when the wind gets too bad, it folds itself up and goes back into storage. Anything exposed to is going to get potentially destroyed by the storms we're going to see. And certainly, if you get a 200-mile-an-hour wind hitting any wind farm, it's going to be destroyed. So, yeah. Any more? All right, I'll say goodbye to everybody except Dave. Dave and I are staying up for a arranged chat. So thanks, everybody, and see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Okay. Dave, yep, let's rage.
All right. Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to quickly just schedule some time. My work calendar gets booked up, and I actually have to go in just a minute as someone's waiting for me already. But I just wanted to grab you quickly. I figured, just talking about it would be easier to hash out the schedule. I don't think I can share my screen right now.
I'll just actually check and see if we've allowed that. Hang on a second.
If you do that, I'll just bring up my calendar.
Yep. Okay. There you got it. Yep.
Okay. There we go. All right. It's okay. Entire screen. Okay. There we go. So basically, I think you'd said that Mondays, Tuesdays would be best for you.
Mondays, Tuesdays, and Fridays. Well, that's without the classes, so I know I've got fairly flexible time.
And then, what time are you relative to Berlin? Are you 1 hour ahead of Berlin?
Same as Berlin.
Same as. Okay.
Yeah.
So what kind of time in the evenings would work for you?
Well, it can't be your evening. So you're in Colorado, aren't you?
Yeah. You can see here, my 9 a.m. is your 5 p.m.
Yeah. Hang on a sec. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, okay, of course. Yeah. I'll actually move this over to the other. And let's actually change it so it goes to my large screen. Hang on a sec.
Yeah, I know it's a bit small.
Yeah. Okay. This is a 43-inch here, so I'll see it clearly. Okay, so you got so when are you looking at there?
So I could do like your 8 to 10 on Monday.
That sounds okay by me. I'll just 8 to 10 Monday, February 2nd. Hang on a second.
5th, Monday 5th.
Monday 5th, 8 to 10. I've got a meeting at 8 o'clock with the board of the pension fund talking about
no problem.
So that one's not on. So what's your next option?
Okay, so then on Tuesday 6th, and a similar 8:30 to 10:30. Yeah.
That's fine. Tuesday 6th is fine. So put that one in. Pop me an invite.
And actually, we could start at 8. We could start at 8.
Okay. Yep.
Okay. Let me. Yeah. Okay. And then if I add you, let me see. Oh, what's your email?
debunking@gmail.com.
Love it.
Yep. Okay.
There you go. Great. Okay, so you should get the Google Meet thing there, and then yeah, well that'll be easier for me. Zoom's a bit unreliable.
Google Meet. Okay.
Great.
Yep. All right. Beauty.
All right. So looking forward to chatting then. Okay.
Okay, man. Thanks a lot. See you later. Bye.
Cheers. Have a good night. Bye.
Bye.